Crown Hill and Lake City. So I feel like this is definitely home for me. It's nice to be back here. So that's me a little bit. So the department is there's a lot of parts of society that are under stress. Hear about staffing issues. We certainly are not immune to that. We've lost about 500 officers since 2020, and I mean, everybody's suffering, right? The fire department they're having staffing crises. My wife works for Northwest Hospital. She talks about there's a lot of parallels between medicine and policing. You'd be surprised, but they're having staffing issues. So it's everywhere. But that being said, it is tough. We've changed. We've been forced to kind of change how we do things to some degree. It used to be every precinct used to have, we had our 911 officers in uniform going to 911 calls and marked patrol cars. But we also had a team of officers called community police team officers who really kind of did like long-term problem solving. They did a lot of neighborhood intervention, community relations, that sort of thing. We had a team of detectives who investigated property crimes across the precincts. I had a team of officers we called it our ACT team, our anti-crime team, that I could send to different areas, like if there's a drug problem or some other problem, I could send them in to kind of basically treat the problem. And all those resources are gone. And basically the North Precinct we're just strictly a 911 uniform patrol presence now. We don't have any of those other resources anymore. So, it's good. I guess what I would say is that's too bad, but it forces us to rethink some things, right? So whereas in the past, officers may think, well, I don't have to do follow-up on, I just have to take a report and I'm done with it, right? I don't have to write a search report. I don't have to do any kind of investigation. Well, now we're having to do more of that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I've got I do have a couple of officers that I've pulled off the street to work on long-term projects. Because I need something that's not just 911 driven, long-term problem solving. That thing has to happen. And so I do have a couple officers who do that. But it's not the whole team, but we're getting a lot of things done that I don't know that, if we were just uniform patrol, we would be able to do. And what used to happen with all of the property crimes, like I said, every precinct had its own squad of detectives that would handle those. And there were about 30-something detectives across the city that handled property crimes. Well, they shrunk that to 11. There are 11 detectives across the city that handle property crimes. And frankly, that's not enough. There's a lot of property crimes in the city. So, one of the things that I did was I took another officer off the street. It's disappointing because I can't afford to lose those officers, but I took another officer off the street and I essentially made him a precinct detective. And he does a lot of things that, he helps kind of, facilitate the process, so to speak. He'll do a lot of follow-up work that he can then feed to the detectives so they don't have to do as much work. So, it's kind of maybe in some ways it's a Band-Aid approach, but, being creative, I think, is something that we've been forced to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So in terms of, that's kind of the structure of the department or the precinct, a little bit different than it used to be. But in terms of, crime numbers, I highly encourage you to, if you're interested in that sort of thing, two things. Our website has really good public-facing dashboards that you can dial down to your specific neighborhood. You can look at, I think, up to back to maybe, I can't remember, 2018 or something. Maybe it's a little farther than that. But you can go back different years and figure out what the crime rates were in those years compared to this year. So I highly encourage that. The other thing I would encourage is every month, the first Wednesday of every month, we have the North Precinct Advisory Council. And right now they're all via Zoom. But basically I kind of give a little precinct update and give some stats. I have a little slideshow I give. I talk about staffing, I answer questions. And the cool thing about that is people from across the North End. North Seattle is huge, right? So it's nice to have people from across the North End all kind of in the same meeting. Right now, they're doing it all on Zoom right now. That was because of COVID. I think they're going to try to do 2 in-person meetings. But if you're interested, you would send an email to spd.ntac@gmail.com, and they'll put you on the mailing list to send you the invite to the Zoom meeting. And we've got one coming up on next week, actually, on Wednesday. So I just talk about crime numbers a little bit. So the city, a couple of things that stand out. Violence is just at an all-time high. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. That's a national problem. And for most of my career, Seattle's been fairly immune to a lot of violent crime. We've been very lucky. And unfortunately, it's caught up to us. Guns seem to be everywhere, and people aren't afraid to use them for the most minor of, things. It's quite scary and disappointing. But so, I mean, even when I compare all the different precincts, so like I said, I used to work at the South Precinct. South has kind of traditionally been where there's been gang activity. It's kind of been the leader in terms of shots fired numbers. Maybe followed a little bit by the West Precinct, the downtown with nightlife issues, bar closing. They had a little bit of that too. And now South is still high, but we're right behind them. I mean, it is crazy how we're just right behind the South Precinct. Some of it is linked to, when I look at the map, and the maps that I have do show me where they occur, where those incidents occur. And there's a lot of stuff that's not just a pattern. It just happens all over. There's no rhyme or reason to it. The one pattern, one exception to that, is look along the Aurora corridor, kind of within the couple blocks of Aurora, right? There's a lot of it. So to try to address some of that, I got a shots fired emphasis patrol with officers working overtime, volunteered to work at night, 5 to 7 days a week to try to match when we've had those issues. They try to be very visible from about 100th up to 145th along Aurora, their lights on, and try to deter that behavior. And since we had it going for a while, I paused it for a minute, partially because we just didn't have the staffing for it. I restarted it in September, and since I did, the numbers they're getting better, knock on wood. But that's definitely a pattern that I've noticed. But there's some outliers too. You may have heard we had a horrible couple of weekends in October in the U District where we had 4 UW students shot outside of a nightclub. Had another one the weekend before where a couple of UW students were shot in a parking lot. So I mean, it's everywhere. It really is everywhere. So that's definitely something that's changed and not for the better. So and something we're trying to work on with uniform patrol, with trying to have visible deterrence, but also we have what used to be our gang unit. It's now called the Gun Violence Reduction Unit, and they do a lot of really good work in trying to trace, whenever there's a shooting and there's shell casings left behind, we collect those shell casings, and those could potentially be matched to other shootings, and we try to do that. That's what that unit does. They try to connect it to the actual guns that we seize and try to make criminal cases against people. But, trying to, every time I try to encourage, every time my officers have the opportunity to take a gun off the street, I want them to do that. Every time they have the opportunity to make an arrest for a gun offense, I want them to do that. And they are doing that. In some ways, like I said, it's a little frightening that when I came on 25 years ago, everyone seems to have a gun. And so, as a brand new officer, I look at my new officers and they look like kids to me. And, I'm concerned for them. I want to make sure that they stay safe and they don't become the victim of one of these shootings. So that's definitely a pattern I've noticed. The other thing that's been lately, this last year, auto theft is just off the hook. And that's another citywide problem. We've always been high. The North End has always been high in auto theft, but it's especially bad this last year. I've heard that one of the reasons it's been bad lately is, I guess, I do not have a TikTok account, but from the kids, I hear that there's a fad on TikTok that shows you how, with a thumb drive, to basically hack Kia or Hyundai and steal it. So we've had a lot of those cars. I'm a little bit surprised that Kia and Hyundai haven't done something in terms of a recall or something to fix that. But just so you all know, if you own a Hyundai or Kia, apparently that's something that's easily hacked. I recommend getting a club or something like that to put on your steering wheel. I personally drive a 1996 Honda Accord that I have the club on, and it has never yet been stolen. So again, knock on wood. But I do recommend that. And so trying to get the word out in terms of prevention if you have a car that's one of those targeted cars, like a 1990s Honda, a Subaru, those sorts of things, buy an anti-theft device. They really do pay off and use it. But I think the other thing we're trying to do at the precinct, besides getting the word out about some preventative tactics, trying to when you look at the data about auto theft, it's a very small number of people committing those crimes. So trying to identify that detective I talked about, every month he puts out a prolific auto thief bulletin out there's about 13 operating in the North End, and trying to make sure that we can keep them in custody, we can arrest them, we can get them charged with auto theft and hold them in custody, then they're not committing auto thefts when they're in custody. And we've had some success with that. We have had, I'll just tell you a little story. There's one guy who was stealing cars. Again, I'm dating myself, I know. But he was stealing cars when I was a brand new officer 25 years ago. He's still stealing cars. And he's a prolific criminal. And he's one of our top auto thieves. And I have two of my really proactive officers make an arrest of him. He was, of course, in his own car and over shock. And he had a gun on him. He was charged. He was allowed to leave jail to go to treatment. And I know this is going to be shocking, but he absconded from his treatment, never got to treatment. But again, we got another warrant on him. And again, my officer, because we know who he is, arrested him again, and he's back to jail again. I don't know for how long, but it feels like shuffling sand against the tide, for some of these folks. But, I think that's a little bit of our strategy, is identifying the prolific offenders and trying to hold them accountable as best we can. And just on that topic, sorry, I'll dry well talk. So on the topic of prolific offenders, I do want to give a shout out to the new city attorney, Ann Davison. One of the things that her office started in March was they call it High Utilizer Initiative. So what they did was they crunched their numbers, they went through all of their data, and they identified about 100 folks who they identify as high utilizers, prolific offenders, using their data in terms of like arrest data, charge data. And they actually came to us and they said, this is what our numbers are telling us, that these people they're committing the most crimes. Does that match with your anecdotal experience? And I gave that list to my officers. And I was, I was pleased to have my officers say, yes, those people we're arresting every single day. We're arresting these same people over and over again. So with that being said, so we got this list. We put out a bulletin of the ones who operate in the North End. A lot of them are, serial shoplifters, organized retail theft. We found a lot of them would be stealing things from the Target at Northgate or Ulta at Northgate, and then walking over to light rail, taking the light rail downtown and selling their wares on 3rd Avenue in a black market. So trying to put an end to that. So we're addressing the prolific offenders. They're identified. We're trying to arrest them as much as we can. We haven't, during COVID, the jail kind of restricted how many people we can book and for what things. So if you're on this high utilized list, you essentially, the city attorney had an agreement with the jail that they will accept anyone on the list for booking. So they go to jail. They are oftentimes held in jail longer than they would have been if it was just like a one-time thing. So they're held in custody, and we've seen the numbers, especially in retail theft numbers, have gotten better since that program started in March. So that's been good. The other thing we've done to try to address kind of the prolific shoplifting and retail theft. It's more than just shoplifting. I want to make sure that you have a picture of what I'm talking about. We have folks who are going to Ulta Cosmetics at Northgate and literally gathering things up and selling it to people who either sell it downtown or package it for sale in Vietnam and other countries overseas. It's insane. I remember looking at the probable cause certification that one of my officers wrote on an offender who walked into Target, gathered a bunch of stuff, and was confronted by the loss prevention officer at Target. He said, let me tell you how it's going to go down. This is what this person said. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want in the store, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop me. And he walked out the door. So that's the kind of attitude that I'm talking about. It's kind of like, there's no consequences for my behavior kind of thing. And so trying to turn that tide has been hard, but using the high utilizer initiative from the city attorney's office, I've got a little bit of money for overtime that I use to augment patrol when we're short staffed, for the shots fired emphasis along Aurora, and the other thing I use it for is a retail theft emphasis on my highest locations. Target, Ulta Cosmetics, which is the #1 loss leader in the entire United States. The Target, the Ulta at North Seattle, that is more in shop listing than any other location in the country. And the third one right now is Lake City Fred Meyer. That's also super high. So trying to basically have officers in patrol cars to deter that behavior, or to be able to respond to it when it happens. That's kind of the idea, and it is working. It is working. So just to the bottom line, when I'm looking at the dashboards about numbers, we overall the whole city is up over last year. We're up like 4% over last year. The north end, because of some of the things we've been doing, we're actually down 2% over last year, mostly because of our property crime stuff. We've had some successes, but still the violent crime is much higher than I would like. Robberies are high, aggravated assaults are high, shots fired are high, homicides are higher than I would like. So those are kind of those are trends that I'm seeing across the city, and we're no exception, fortunately. So to kind of segue to staffing, and I kind of talk about kind of the restructuring of the precinct, how it looks now. We're really kind of a 911 only uniform patrol presence. So when I was at the 4th Precinct about 2017 as a lieutenant, and we had about 210 officers. And we're now down to, last time I checked, just shy of 160. And so that's spread across all 3 watches. So I guess what I've got three shifts, right? For a 24/7 operation. And every one of those shifts has a minimum number of officers I'm supposed to field. And that number is generated by based on the call loads of the city and of the watch, right? Of the precinct and of the watch. So they look at that, and that's how they tell me, how many officers I should have to respond to calls. It is rare that I have enough officers to meet those minimums, and that's where I have a little bit of overtime money to augment staffing. But it is a struggle sometimes to have sufficient officers to make those minimums. And officers know that, and they're working, as hard as they can to answer calls. But that's a struggle. And I also appreciate. I want to say that city council is trying to come up with some alternative responses, and I do think that's a good idea. I think there are a lot of calls, when I look at the calls, that I think could be handled better by other entities other than us. So I think that's a good kind of route to sort of explore, and hopefully we'll get there. We're just not there yet, right? Right now we're it. So until that happens, we're on the hook for those calls. And I think priority calls we're very good at, right? And the Ingraham school shooting is an example of that. So if it's a life safety issue, we're very good. We drop everything and we go to it. I think when it's it's a little more problematic when it's a lower priority call, and I see calls that are lower priority but still should require some police intervention. I see those calls holding 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 hours, right? And that's not acceptable. And that's where I hopefully with some hiring and maybe some development of alternative call responses, we'll get there. But right now it's a struggle. What else? I don't know if there's. What's that? Ingram. Yes, thank you. I knew I was going to get there. So Ingram. So the Ingram school shooting. Again, I keep going back to how long I've been on, but seriously, I've been on for 25 years, and we've throughout my career we've trained for active shooter, right? I've been to lots of trainings. All my colleagues have, and in my head, I kind of thought, knock on wood, I've never been to one, and maybe I'm never going to have to go to one. And thank goodness this wasn't an active shooter, even though it's as tragic as it is, of course. But still, this is the first time that that I or any of my officers have had to respond to something like this, and it's unfortunate that it's come to Seattle. But in any case, you know, the call came in. It was there quickly. It took us 4 minutes from the call to my officers going inside, and they did exactly how they were trained. I have to say I'm very proud of my officers because they did exactly what they were supposed to do, and they went in. They treated it like an active shooter until it proved it wasn't. Right? They got there. They, you know, students directed them to where the victim was, and they went in, and you know, they don't know what they have, right? So they see a victim down on the ground, and there was the school nurse was actively doing CPR on the victim, and one of my officers basically said, "I'm going to help her," and the others went on to see. They don't know, right? Is there a shooter? Is there another shooter? So while the nurse and one of my officers was working on giving the victim medical care, the others went to basically look for the shooter, and they found out relatively quickly that the shooter had left the school. And so another one of my officers went to the office. The security staff said, "We know who it is. We have really good video." They provided a photo of the shooter, and this is, you know, technology is great, right? Because everyone has cell phones now. All my officers have cell phones. They emailed out a picture of this person right away, so everyone had a picture of the shooter pretty quickly. And then, you know, so then instead of, you know, I had another team of officers that were waiting to go in, but once we realized that the shooter had left the school and we knew who that person was, we directed them to start the area search for that person. So they started to do that. And again, this is still all personnel from the North Precinct, right? So it ended up being, you know, all 5 precincts showed up. We had we had about 89 employees, SPD employees, involved in this incident at some point. So I mean, it was a pretty, you know, across department wide incident. But this is still just the North Precinct officers. So we're doing that, and then this is kind of, I mean, I get a little bit of an amusing story. So I get a phone call. We're still doing, you know, we're still kind of like in the initial phases of this. I get a phone call from the lieutenant who oversees the harbor unit. Okay, so he says, "Hey, I've got 4 officers. Do you want them?" I'm like, "Hey, I mean, I'll take whoever I can get, right? I don't care." So he says, "Sure, I'll send them up your way." And I don't know where the harbor unit is, down on Lake Union, kind of by our Ivor's Fish House, Gasper's Park. So I say yes, I'll take them, and I don't really think anything more of it. But again, remember the picture of this person has gone out. We have a direction of travel that we think the person left at. So we're continuing to do what we're doing, and not too long afterwards, I hear on radio, we all hear on radio, there's 4 officers in one car coming up Aurora, start looking for the suspect, and they actually say, I hear them say, "We think we see the suspect at a bus stop on Aurora," and you know, we're kind of listening, and the shooter and his friend boarded the bus. The officer stopped the bus. They took both of them off the bus, took them into custody. One of them had the gun on him. I mean, so it's amazing that 4 harbor officers, you know, but I mean, it really was an all hands on deck kind of thing. So 4 harbor officers get the credit for actually making the arrest of the shooter. But so I mean, and just so you know, afterwards, I did a debrief with my officers and with the SWAT team. And the SWAT team, just so you know, they were there, and I made the decision not to send them into the school because I knew, you know, this is no longer an active shooter incident. I really wanted them to stand by in case we had, you know, we found the suspect, maybe he was barricaded in the house or something like that. I wanted the SWAT team ready to go, potentially serve a warrant and go make an arrest if that was, you know, if that was going to happen. But I had a debrief with the SWAT team and my officers, and then I had another debrief with the school officials. And you know, I just got to tell you, we have a very good relationship with Seattle Public Schools. I interact with them all the time, and this was no different. I think, you know, we both talked about it was a productive meeting in that we talked about what went well. I mean, nothing went poorly in our response. I think both did what we needed to do. But like one thing I was unaware of is every school in Seattle has a predetermined parental reunification site in case of an emergency, which is brilliant. But I didn't know that. So the school district said, "Hey, we'll send you that for every single school in the North End." And you can have that on your shared drive. You can share it with all your officers. So if, God forbid, this were to happen again or whatever, if there's an event where we need that, because we did, I was surprised, maybe I should be, but parents started arriving very quickly. I understand, right? They're scared. They're probably getting text messages from their kids. They want to know what to do. So we picked an area for them to kind of hang out until we had resolved the situation and get them back together with their kids. But just having that information about the school district has that, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? So that was helpful to know. I guess the other thing that was helpful to know is they're slowly but surely converting all of their schools to a prox card entry system. And Ingram doesn't have it yet, but it's coming. But they agreed to give us a prox card that we could have like a supervisor area. So if we ever needed access to school, because they went into lockdown, right? And when my officers got there, the school was appropriately locked down. So they basically had to bang on one of the doors until someone opened it for them, which it is what it is. But being able to get into the school when it's on lockdown that'll be a good thing. So they were totally willing to do that. So that was helpful. It was really nice to have that meeting to kind of, because we're all here we want to make sure the kids are safe, right? Both of us do. We just have different roles. So that was nice to have that debrief and to share that information, and hopefully that will improve. I hope it never happens again, of course. But if there's another incident at school, we'll have some different things that we can work on that will help us respond better. So that ends my lots of talking. Questions? I'm sure there are questions. And I don't know how you want to write questions.
Yeah, let me just go over real quick. We have some discussion guidelines here with the Q&A. So I just wanted to go over those real quick and kind of tell you guys how we want to be doing this. First of all, I'm David Field from the Howard Community Club Board. And so I've been tagged to moderate the Q&A. So first of all, the goal here is to just give everybody a chance to ask a question. We want everybody to be able to have a chance. So if you've asked a question once, please wait until others have a chance to ask a question. Please keep all interactions simple and respectful. And please refrain from speaking unless you're the one asking the question. So in other words, if somebody else is asking a question or Captain Grossman is answering the question, please don't interrupt. I'm going to ask people to come up to the microphone right here if you do have a question, and you can actually line up. And please make sure you know what your question is before you get up to the mic, so that you kind of know what you're going to be asking ahead of time. And we also are hosting this on Zoom. There's quite a few people participating right now over Zoom, and we are recording this meeting. So your questions will be recorded. Just want to let you know that ahead of time. And we'll give folks on Zoom a chance every once in a while to ask a question too. So let's see if I did anything here. I don't think so. So if you're ready to ask a question, yeah.
I've got a question on Zoom.
You've got a question on Zoom already. Well, let's give folks in the room a chance. So,
well, I got the answer.
Yeah, can we just intersperse them every once in a while? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for being here. And I have noticed the difference, and I've been here for 15 years, and so I have noticed the difference of not as much police around. What's the strategy for the prostitution on Aurora?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. How to start with that one. And I will say, when I mentioned about the shootings along there, Aurora, a large number of them are related to prostitution. So, that's where, there's some that might say, it's a victimless crime, or, why should we intervene in prostitution? There's a number of reasons why we should. I mean, I just got done reviewing a couple of really horrific human trafficking cases where, a woman was beat within a fraction of her life by a very horrible pimp working from California. So, it's that kind of behavior that I don't want, and also just the violence, the shots fired that is related. We've had a number of shootings related to prostitution. So there's a couple of issues. One, it's a resource issue, partially. So we used to have our human trafficking unit, a follow-up unit that handles those cases. There are 2 detectives remaining in that unit. And they're known to everybody, right? So they can't do undercover work anymore. We do sometimes partner with King County to tackle that, but that's a issue. The other issue is, I'll just be honest, political will. At the moment, there is no political will to do a whole lot other than, I'll say there hasn't been a whole lot of political will or interest in tackling prostitution, whether it's the prostitutes themselves or the patrons, the Johns, right? There was for a time an interest. They were doing some John things, they called them, where they targeted the customers, so to speak. They did that for a little while. There wasn't a whole lot of, that didn't have a whole lot of impact on the sex trade on Aurora. The city council, there used to be an ordinance called prostitution loitering. That was something we can enforce. The city council eliminated that ordinance, so that is no longer a law that we can enforce. So that's historically. I was just talking this morning with the woman who is the criminal division head of Seattle City Attorney's Office, because these are the prostitution activity that's largely misdemeanor activity, which is handled by the Seattle City Attorney's Office. So I don't know if you're familiar with it. Felonies are charged by the King County Prosecutor's Office. Misdemeanors are handled by the Seattle City Attorney's Office. So I was just talking to her, and she did tell me that there is a renewed commitment to do something about it, that she has having conversations with King County Prosecutor's Office and with the woman who is the chief of our investigations bureau, who oversees the human trafficking unit. And there is some talk about some strategy. So it's early on. So I'm cautiously optimistic that they're going to start doing something about it, but it has been frustrating because we get the calls when we see it. I got to say, for some yard work, I rented a truck from Handy Andy, and I as off duty, of course. I drove from Handy Andy to Lowe's, and I had to dodge. They were trying to jump into my truck, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Some of the, I have the shots fired emphasis that's working. Some of that is a byproduct of that, trying to deter some of that behavior. I mean, obviously shots fired is the priority, right? I don't want people shooting at each other, but if having officers out with their little blue lights on scares customers away, or maybe makes women decide maybe not tonight, then that's a byproduct of that too. So I mean, that's what I can do at my level, but I'm hopeful. Like I said, I just had that conversation earlier today with the criminal chief, and there does seem to be some movement toward doing something. So stay tuned.
From the Zoom, how should we be reporting trespassing, and if so, how and where?
So, I mean, criminal trespassing is a crime. So that's where someone is somewhere they should be, and they don't have permission to be there. A couple of things about that. I mean, if someone is trespassing and you've asked them to leave and they don't want to leave, or they refuse to leave, I mean, we can enforce that. However, just so you know, that's not an offense that can be booked into jail. So we can't make an arrest for trespassing. So a lot of times, to be honest, a lot of those calls, it's a low priority call for criminal trespass. A lot of times those calls will hold for a long time, and honestly, by the time we get there 6 hours later, the problem has resolved itself. But even if we get there and the person's still there, our strategy is really to just try to persuade them that they need to belong, because we just don't have the ability to it. We can't put people into jail for that offense. We can't arrest them. There's no reason to arrest them. So it really would be a lot of diplomacy and trying to convince someone that they really need to move on. And we do that. But that's a call to 911 or the non-emergency number, which that's when I talked about staffing, what's now the Community Safety Services Communications Center, CSCC, Community safety, oh boy, CSC used to be 911. It is 911, but it's a separate agency, and they're having similar staffing issues. So I hear reports that they don't answer. So the non-emergency number goes to the same place that 911 does, so answered by the same call takers. Just the 911 gets priority; they get answered more quickly than the non-emergency number. But they have trouble hiring enough call takers. So I hear reports from some folks that the non-emergency number isn't answered or it takes a long time to answer it. So a 911 call, that will get you at least in the queue for an officer when they're available.
Grossman?
Yeah.
So right up the street here, we've got kind of a mess going on. Any thoughts on that?
Which mess is that? The encampment?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've had a little bit of, so I'll start by saying SP no longer does encampments, right? We're out of that business, and I think it's a good thing. This wasn't in our wheelhouse. We weren't really equipped to do that. So the citywide team that they do is every week they actually talk about all the encampments citywide and prioritize them. They actually do look at data. They look at data like about shots fired, criminal activity related to it, the 911 calls related to encampments, and then they prioritize clearing those encampments based on that data. So that's kind of, and Find It, Fix It app on your phone. That's the best way to actually raise that issue with that group of folks that make that decision. So, and we have had some success. So they cleared the encampment off the interurban trail earlier this year, and the big one behind Home Depot, that was huge. And, for a long time, that was kind of a thorn in everyone's side. So, in terms of, I would say if you see criminal behavior related to the encampment, that's a 911 call. But if it's, it's an encampment and there's really, it's just an encampment that's not legal, use the Find It, Fix It app to report it, and it'll get prioritized. And hopefully, at some point, it will be addressed by the city.
Appreciate what you guys do.
Yeah, thanks.
You mentioned the Target situation, Home Depot shopper here. I see that all the time. I'm just curious.
You're good. I can hear you. You're good. Oh, I see what you're saying.
I am curious. What happens as far as, is it a store issue where they can't go after someone? Do they witness shoplifting? Is it a city enforcement issue? Is it a prosecution issue? Is it a county-wide thing? Is it state? I just wonder if we're different than the rest of the world with what we see in that.
I think, most of the big box stores, the corporate stores, they really have a hands-off policy in terms of, a lot of them do hire loss prevention officers, but they're not allowed for policy to physically intervene. Like, they can tell someone to stop, but they can't put their hands on them or block their way or anything like that. So they really are more kind of a witness than anything else. So that's, so that's one issue. And I think COVID threw a big wrench in that, right? It's a lot of things. Because of the jail, our staffing was low. The jail was not taking misdemeanors into custody. I think there was also kind of a lack of anyone kind of paying attention to that. I was talking about the city attorney tracking high utilizers. There was no one really doing that. Officers anecdotally, like they said, hey, this is the time I've arrested John Smith. It's the same thing. And that's great, but no one systematically or systemically was saying, hey, this person needs something, right? They need some intervention to stop them from doing what they're doing. So I think all those things have built up over time. And like I said, I think COVID obviously threw a wrench in that. So I think getting back to where the expectation is, no, you cannot shoplift or you can't commit crimes. And I'm not saying, I want to make sure that either I or any of my officers think, shoplifting should be thrown away in jail for the rest of your life. Of course not. I mean, some sort of accountability or consequences, right? Whether it's, and I think the city attorney's office and the Seattle Municipal Court generally have pretty good kind of escalating interventions, right? If it's your first time shoplifting, what happens is a report gets written, it's documented, and you might have to do like some community service or that sort of, right? I mean, it's pretty low level for a first offense. I'm talking about people who are stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise, right? And nothing has really been done in the past, and I say past 3, 4, 5 years, right? So changing that expectation of people that there are consequences and people do care and they are paying attention. I mean, it's also sad to see, I don't know if anyone's been downtown in a while, but I mean, all the empty storefronts and, I read about stores leaving. I mean, it'd be a sad world if essentially Seattle's left, especially we're only left with big box stores, right? And the small guys, I was just down in Ballard this weekend, and a number of stores with plywood on their windows, and my wife was shopping in the store, and they've been burglarized like 3 times. And at some point, those small businesses, they're gonna leave, right? I mean, I don't know how that's sustainable. So I think we do need to turn the ship around if we're gonna keep those small businesses here and thriving.
What's the news on the new North Precinct building?
Oh my gosh. Oh, so I mean, it's interesting. When I know I'm a broken record. When I came on 25 years ago, that building was built in 1984, and it was built for. I mean, I guess this is the good thing about our staffing shrinking, because we're now right side. But I mean, it even, I'll just say that. I've heard me say that I support alternative response for some calls. I think that's a good thing. But, North Seattle is huge, right? It is huge. And in my personal humble opinion, North Seattle has never had appropriate staffing of police. It's never had enough. I mean, I just tell you, as an officer looking in the summertime, seeing 45, 50 calls holding for service because we can't get to those calls. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so, yes, we do need alternative response. We need to decide which calls actually need a police officer, which could be handled by other things. But in my humble opinion, I think the precinct where it is, the city spent about $15 million on it when they said they weren't going to build a new building. They spent about $15 million to give it a spruce up. I know we've seen the trailers in the back, a little annoying, but they are. But I think that facility could stay there and actually be okay. But what I would recommend is breaking the North Precinct into 2 and having another precinct on the east side of the freeway, because it just makes sense in terms of traveling north-south in the north end is pretty easy. You got Aurora, you got I-5. If you want to go from east to west, you know what I'm talking about. It's crazy, and it's not uncommon for an officer up in Lake City to have to drop what he's doing and drive to Ballard because there are no officers at Ballard, and that's insane. Man, it's a 40-minute drive, during the day. So I think having another building on the east side, here's where. So the UWPD, University of Washington Police Department, built a new facility in 2017 for $18 million. That's how much it took. I mean, they own the property, so the land is not an issue. $18 million. They just did a refresh of the North Precinct for $15 million. So, what I'm saying is it can be done for a reasonable amount of money. The behemoth they were going to build at 130th and Sonia site, would have been nice to have a precinct. That was supposed to cost $150 million. I think that's crazy. And again, that's not me, the captain. That's taxpayer, right? I think that's insane. So what I'm saying is I think it can be done for a reasonable amount of money, but the political will needs to come together, and I'm starting to see the tide turn. I've had really good conversations with Councilmember Sarah Nelson, Councilmember Peterson. I know Councilmember Horace has been supportive of, she was a champion of a new North Precinct a long time ago, and I'm sure she still is. So, I think there's some support for it, but I think, you all need to voice your support, obviously, say what you want. But at the moment, that project's not going to happen. But like I said, I hear rumblings about talk of it. But again, in my opinion, I would keep the current precinct and then take half the staffing and move it across the freeway, and then you'd have, you'd have 2 precincts. I mean, I think they both need to be staffed appropriately. I would recommend doing that.
I'm just wondering if there's a list of the crimes that cannot be booked into the jail that you're not arresting for. And if that be the case, how are you managing to keep a record of the frequent flyers so those folks can be handled by the city attorney's office as frequent flyers if there's no arrest record?
Right. So yes and yes, there is a list that the jail issued of crimes that they will not accept booking for. Except the exception is they will accept for booking someone who's on the city attorney's high utilizer list. So if you happen to be on that list, they will accept you for booking. So I mean, it is, and just too, I mean, just because say you're not a high utilizer, but you're just shy of that, right? You're still a frequent shopper, I'll say. And if we can't put you into jail because you're not on the list, it doesn't mean nothing happens. Reports sent to the city attorney's office, they'll review it for filing. Oftentimes, they actually do file, and what happens is a warrant gets issued for them. If a warrant is issued, that's bookable into the jail, right? So it's not, the initial incident that you get booked into jail for potentially, but you get, or you get a summons in the mail, right? Maybe you don't get a warrant, but you're told, hey, you got to come to court to address this charge. So maybe you never go to jail, depending on, what your criminal history. Yeah.
If you can't get through on the non-emergency line, how do you report stolen license plates?
I would call 911. I mean, it goes to the same place. I mean, you're calling the exact same people, but it's a prioritization issue. But 911 is, they have standards for how often or how soon they have to answer those calls. They're tracked. The non-emergency number is not. So it does go to the same place. But if, I mean, that's still how you do it.
Is there a plan in place for improving safety of the kids in school in light of this Ingraham shooting incident?
We're always talking, and like I said, we just had that debrief. I know Chief Diaz and the school district had some ongoing conversation about what to do, whether to have, I don't know if we're going to have resource officers again. I don't really know if that's, I think right now our resources aren't such that we can really afford to do that. So if that's something that they're interested in doing down the road, I don't know. I mean, all I can say is that we do have a really good relationship with Seattle Public Schools. They have access to our radios, so they can broadcast our radios, and they do when they need to. So they can talk to us. They have their own security team. They're unarmed security, but they're they know the kids, they know the school, they know the system. So I mean, I think we have a good partnership. They're talking about redoing like I said, the access system to the school. I watched the video that they showed me that all of the staff has to watch about active shooters, and I thought it was well done. The one thing that I suggested that again, when I was at the South Precinct, we had a meeting with all of the South End principals and I think it was principals and like vice principals. So the precinct, it's like precinct leadership met with the principals, and I haven't seen that up here. And again, COVID threw a wrench in the works, but I think I'd like to do that again. I suggested that just so it's nice to get to know people, not even like here, right? Not in the context of a 911 call or a crisis situation where you're just like, hey, just I'm Kevin, and and just know who they are, and so there's like we build trust just knowing who we are and interacting with human beings. So I think there's value to that, and I'm optimistic that's going to happen. That's what I would say to that.
My name's Jay Hersmark. I'm going to admit up front I'm going to be critical, but I'm going to end with a suggestion.
Okay.
I'm the president of a homeowners association. Our building was, our backyard is I-5, that interchange at Northgate, where there was a big homeless camp. I don't know how big it was relative to others, but it was about 20 tents, I think. I've had many opportunities to deal with the Seattle Police Department, primarily because of those folks. people in my building call me to call the police. Okay, so I've had lots of experience. I haven't had a real satisfactory experience. And it seems because you guys are equipped with one tool, and that is force. And you can't use force most of the time. And certainly none of the times that I've ever had to deal with you folks. There's lots of other tools that you have or that are in existence, whether you have them or not, that need to be used, but it doesn't seem to be used, those tools don't seem to be used very well.
Jay, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. My question, based on that, is why don't you hire folks who are not, I'm not sure what the title is, what the official job is, title is, but certified police officers, to do some of this work? The vast majority of the times when I've dealt with you folks, I don't need somebody who's carrying a gun. The bad thing has already occurred. There's no one to arrest. There's other people. In my job, I had other people who didn't have the expertise I did, and I would help them, but they did most of the mundane stuff. And I don't think that even in the police academy, people get trained on all these other things you guys do. But detectives, you don't need to have a gun to carry a gun. Why don't you hire folks that have these abilities, that don't need guns? You can't find police officers. I'm trying to ask a question.
Ask the question, please.
I'm asking a question.
I want to give everyone.
I don't see anyone else waiting for me. So why don't you, I'm assuming that you're in a position to deal with the budget. Why don't you hire people who are not police officers to take some of these tasks over so your police officers can be available for the things that need a gun?
And I would disagree with that. I think that that's part of the alternative response that City Council is looking for. You're right. I mean, it used to be that all of the dispatchers and call takers, those all used to be police officers, and that doesn't require law enforcement background to be a call taker or a dispatcher. So those are all civilianized. It used to be one of our evidence warehouses. Those were all sworn police officers. Well, eventually those all got to be civilianized too. I don't think that's a bad thing. So I think we're kind of trending in that direction. Some of the folks that we do have, we have a contract where you probably heard our crisis intervention team. Again, we don't have enough of those, but there's, I think, 4 or 5 officers. They're partnered with a mental health professional, and they're very busy. So you've got a sworn police officer. Actually, they were at the Ingraham call as well, and they were there to. I mean, a lot. They were helping the school district, and also, they were also there kind of talking to parents and that sort of thing. But so you got a police officer and a mental health professional in the same car together. And so, but I don't disagree with you that trying to kind of go through our what we actually do, what we need sworn police officers who have arrest authority and can use force, and those who don't. But I will also say, you say that like our only tool is force. Well, I mean, we are the only entity authorized by law to use force. That's true. But I can tell you, the best police officers, and I mean the ones that we're hiring and training now, are very good at mediating disputes, resolving disputes short of any kind of force. And sometimes in very volatile situations that involve weapons or the potential of weapons, or the potential of someone harming themselves or others. So, I mean, I think that's a skill that I think we've gotten. I mean, I think we've gotten better over time. We haven't always been good at that, but we are getting better. Every time I get a new officer at the precinct, I sit down with them for about half an hour just to get to know them a little bit, and to give them my 2 cents about my expectations and my philosophy of policing and that sort of thing. But I have been very heartened and impressed by the caliber of people we're hiring. It's, it's very different than, again, when I started. But, people who are in their second careers, people who have really great life experience. We just hired a woman who used to be a Pierce County designated crisis responder. So she's one of the folks down in Pierce County who's authorized by law to commit people for a mental health evaluation. So she's now a police officer with us. Having that wealth of experience, that she brings with her as a police officer, that's an example of the types of people that I'm seeing being hired. And I think that will also, in addition to, figuring out who needs to be, sworn and carry a gun and a badge and who doesn't, but also having those officers who do carry guns and badges and have arrest power and authorized use of force when it's appropriate, have that background. I think that will also benefit the city and make us better at what we do.
If I could do this a little better than the last time I did this, but thank you for getting over to Ingraham so quickly. I had 2 kids at Ingraham, and I was really thrilled to hear how quick you got over there.
How scary.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah.
My kids are grown.
Oh, okay.
But they had some challenges when they were there too. We see drug deals going on all the time going through the drainage area over here, as well as on Aurora. And we see people get, shooting up on 128th and 135th. I've seen that personally on 135th several times. Is there anything that we as, besides calling 911, is there anyone else that we should be calling besides your precinct to get some action about those circumstances, as well as robberies in progress? Because we have theft all over this area. And we've had bicycles stolen off our side yard and little things, minor little things for us personally. But we've had a lot of people. One lady we were at a meeting at our buddy's house over here, and she had her bounce house taken out of her storage shed. Somebody probably thought it was a tent, little big for that. But is there anything that we could do to contact someone else, or are we supposed to call 911? Should we set up like block watches or some way to help the police? I don't know if there's anything that we could do about that.
So let me think about what I would say is the issue, especially the issue of drugs, that's a tricky one for many reasons, and I'll go into that in a second. But if there's a way, you can make the space less conducive to that, and we have 2 crime prevention coordinators who can come out and do that for both businesses and homeowners to give an idea of you need lighting, or you need to trim the bushes, or those are 2 small examples, but anything you can do to kind of make it less hospitable for criminal activity. I think that's what I would recommend first, right? But anything that we would do is really, it's not going to address the core problem. So that's what I would recommend. But just on the subject of drugs and drug use, that's another thing that's just been from the opioid epidemic to now fentanyl. That's another societal issue that the police aren't going to solve that issue, right? That's a bigger issue than the police could solve. And just to tell you, we just don't have the resources, even if we wanted to. That's not drug dealing and using is just not something, even if it was appropriate, or we could actually do something about it, it's not feasible with the resources we have. Plus, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Blake decision of the Supreme Court. So the Washington Supreme Court essentially invalidated Washington's possession of narcotics law. So simple possession of narcotics essentially is not illegal in the state of Washington for the moment. Now they're talking about doing something about that. No, not illegal. not illegal. Now, I mean, there's some, the Washington State Legislature is talking about passing a bill passing a law that would recriminalize it. The other thing that could happen is the Seattle City Council could pass an ordinance. They could pass their own ordinance making it illegal. Again, I question about whether that would be super effective anyway. But I mean, at the moment, just so simple possession of narcotics is not technically illegal. Drug dealing is legal, but that's a tricky issue as well. So just to give you an example, so in order for that's a felony. Dealing drugs is still against the law. It's a felony. But in order for the prosecutor's office to even consider filing a charge of dealing drugs, they require evidence from an undercover police officer who makes 3 buys from the same person. And we don't have the resources for that. I mean, we just don't. We still have a small narcotics section that do some of that activity, but they're really focused on the big dealers, right? They're focused on the people dealing, hundreds of fentanyl pills downtown, not the guy who just sells a couple pills on Aurora kind of thing. So again, it's a resource issue as well. That anyway, it's a tricky issue.
Can I ask you if these oftentimes, at least several of the tents that we've seen, are having drug use in them. In order to get the money to pay for the drugs, they have to go out and get that from somewhere. They're not old enough to be on Social Security.
Right.
So that means that they're either stealing from one of us or stealing at the stores or somewhere to get their money to buy those drugs. And I'm not talking about pot because pot's pretty darn cheap.
Right.
But fentanyl and heroin and all of that stuff, that isn't cheap.
Right.
They have to be getting it somewhere.
Right. Well, and that's where, like the high riser thing I was telling you about. I mean, the folks who are stealing, thousands of dollars from Target and Ulta, I mean, like I said, they're taking their merchandise and selling it downtown or overseas or whatnot, and they're doing it to buy drugs, right? That's why they're doing it. But if that's a method that we can hold accountable through, basically through the retail theft issue, I mean, that's more effective and more likely to do something than trying to address the drug issue. That's a trickier issue, more complicated. But yes, I think your point is like if we can address where they're getting the money from, absolutely, that's going to be that combined with trying to make where they're using or selling drugs less conducive because there's lights or people, right? Other normal people going about their business, they're less likely to engage in criminal behavior in that type of environment. Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess I have lots of questions and I'll try to narrow it down to 1 or 2. It seems like the underlying elephant in the room is that you are severely understaffed to meet the needs of our city, to meet the needs of the north end and just of your massive precinct. We hear in the news all the time about how the city council has, we're giving money to the SD to hire, but then I just saw an article today where that temporary, 80 officers, that's now gone, because it was a temporary fix. So that has to be incredibly frustrating for you guys as a citizen that doesn't get a phone call or a response to a 911 call. It's incredibly frustrating. So it really seems like the city council is responsible for how many police officers and how many boots on the ground they actually have. And I understand that moving towards like social workers that alleviate some of the calls that, they can take care of, but we still need more police officers regardless. Is there something that we can do as citizens first? Is it true, my understanding is correctly, that it is basically the city council that is determining how many police officers you can hire? And then when we hear numbers about SPD just hired X amount of officers, how many of that, what's the average percentage of North Precinct officers that we're actually getting? And my last part is, what can we do as citizens or as a community to help the cause, to get more boots on the ground, so to speak, to help you guys, to help us all?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, so recruiting and retention is a huge issue, not just for SPD, right? I mean, that's across the country. I mean, you've got kind of a perfect storm of people getting to the end of their careers and starting to retire. So that's kind of a natural thing. You've got a lot of different agencies competing for the same resources. So that's another issue. We're all kind of out competing each other for the same pool of people. You have an economy that, has been very good in terms of a lot of job openings, well-paying jobs, other sectors. And, frankly, to maybe some Gen Zers, like, why would they take a job as a police officer when I could take a job with Amazon and make more money and not get potentially shot at, right? So those are all kind of issues that are kind of we're facing. And I think, and I'm not, so I don't want to, when you said, the budget about city council, I'm not super concerned. I think city council is supportive of getting the SPD right sized. I'm not super concerned, like, in the short term about the budget discussion going on. That's short term. And I get it, right? We're not, they've got a certain number of, yes, they have a certain number of positions that were authorized. And just realistically, we are not going to be able to fill those positions, just because of, sheer attrition, and we're just not going to be able to in that short term. So, they can always, every year they're going to, or every 2 years, they're going to revisit that and adjust it appropriately. So I'm not super concerned about that. I think, the long term, what I'm concerned about is trying to make Seattle PD, why should someone who potentially wants to be a police officer, why should they come to Seattle, right? And so I look back on my own, like, I remember when I was applying, I really, Seattle and King County were the only two places I was interested in. And, a lot of it is because of the diversity, the variety. It's an exciting, interesting place to be. And I can say that I've had a varied and interesting career, and I don't think you would get that in a lot of other places, right? So trying to convey that. But I think the other thing is, and I've told this, Alex Peterson has been really good about asking, what should the city council do to incentivize people to work here, either to come here initially or to stay here and not go to another department. And one of the things I do really appreciate that Seattle PD, you only have to have a high school diploma to be a police officer, and I think that's a good thing, because I think that encourages people from all backgrounds to be here. However, where we fall down is if you decide, I want to go get my bachelor's degree, you don't get anything for that. You don't get incentivized to do that. There's no incentive. No one pays for you to go do that. You don't get incentive paid once you have your degree. I would change that. Again, that's, if you're talking to your city council, or, if that's something you want to advocate for, that's what I would do. I think it's also, it would be good for many reasons. I think, including, it would incentivize people being here. It would allow us to, don't we want to have, at the end of the day, an educated workforce? I think it's great if they're here maybe without that education, but don't we want to provide them at least the incentive or the ability to do that once they're here? So I think that's something that I would recommend. The other thing is, housing costs are crazy. And, again, I did live in the city for a long time, but when I'm meeting with those new officers that are coming here, none of them live in the city. It's a little sad because, for many reasons, but when I'm talking to brand new officers, most of them either live far north, like, they're living up in Lake Stevens and Arlington and whatnot, Marysville, or they're living way far south. And I can tell you, the ones who live far south, when they get assigned to the North Precinct, they ask me, when can I leave? Because I don't want to work here. And I don't want someone who doesn't want to work at the North Precinct. I want someone who's invested in the precinct, who wants to be here, right? So, and I get that. I try to make it so they get to go to the place that's closest to their house. But I think that really proves up, we need to kind of figure something out. And I mean, you know, Washington's Constitution prohibits, this is one thing that gets in the way. I mean, Washington's Constitution prohibits making gifts of public property. So, you know, like, you know, housing incentives or whatever, I've heard that argument, and maybe it's true that we can't provide housing incentives or whatever because the Constitution prevents it. And maybe that's the case, and maybe there's nothing we can do about it. But so I know, like in Colorado, they're experimenting with building housing for, you know, teachers, firefighters, police officers, you know, like public housing for public employees that's affordable, and they're in your community, right? You have those public servants who are working or living and working in your community. And to me, that's a great idea. Again, I mean, if it's prohibited by the Constitution, then of course we can't do it, but it's something that should be explored at least. So those are two things I think. I don't know if I answered all your questions, but that's what I would say if we could do some of those things to incentivize people to stay here, live here, and you know, and I think sell ourselves better too. I mean, I know the city council has allocated some money for recruitment, and I think that's good to try to get the word out that this is a good place to be a police officer. I mean, I'll tell you, I go to trainings across the country, and I mean, you know, I mean, I'm not saying we're perfect. We've had a lot of issues. I do think the consent decree has made us a better department. I will say that. But I think, you know, when I see us now, and we really are, we're really a learning organization. I see training that we're really trying to kind of think outside the box. When I look at the work that my officers are doing, they're creative, they're problem solving. The amount of force they're using is minuscule compared to what it was. And it's I mean, it really is appropriate. When I look at what my officers are doing, I'm like, that's they're doing it appropriately, they're documenting it appropriately. So selling that other, and you know, then I also hear horror stories about people who actually, one of my officers collaborated with another department, shall remain nameless, and came back like, oh my God, like I cannot believe, you know, that other agencies in the state operate in that way. And you know, thank God we're not like that. But you know, like, I'm not saying we're perfect, of course, and we still have a lot to do, and that's a good thing to have something to strive to. I'm talking a lot again. But thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We're closing down to about 8:30, about time we're gonna finish up here. Dave, what do we want to? Yeah, I was about to ask Captain if you have time for maybe one or two more questions. Would
Sure.
that be okay with you?
I mean, my bedtime's 9, so it's fine.
Can we go two more questions?
This is a quick one. Are paid subscription alarm services effective? Do you respond? You know, like ADT, do you come if the thing goes off?
I mean, are we dispatching those calls? Yes. Our response times vary between, I would say, 6 and 8 hours. So, but I mean, I would say, you know, I mean, it's a deterrent, right? If you have one that makes a lot of noise and whatnot, I mean, it's less likely that someone's going to want to break into your house if the alarm's going off. So, in that sense, and some actually do have, you know, they have their own private security that will come and respond. I'm sure that costs more. But I mean, I think anything you can do to make it make your house less desirable to be broken into, and a loud alarm saying, you know, sounding in your ear, and maybe calling attention to you, it's maybe not a bad thing, even if it does potentially take the cops a long time to get there.
You're doing what you do. My question is, we had a encampment behind our house for like 9 months, so I have that perspective. That and seeing like what's happening in the city and all the small businesses closing, I feel like drugs are a huge part of the problem. So I guess I feel like I'm not necessarily hearing that from you. Do you agree with that?
I do. I just think there's not a whole lot of tools in our toolbox for the police to deal with that, and maybe that's a good thing. I mean, I think, you know, I think there should be other things, you know, potentially mandatory treatment. There hasn't been a lot of consequences for criminal behavior that, you know, that feeds into that, right? So like I keep talking about the retail theft. I mean, that retail theft is certainly part of the drug cycle, right? So if you're not being stopped for shoplifting, continue to do those things. So, I mean, absolutely, it is a huge issue. I work for the police department, and I can tell you, I don't think that, arresting people and charging them with crimes for drug activity is going to solve our problem. I mean, I think dealing with the dealers is certainly something we should be doing, absolutely. And, that maybe is more criminal, that's criminal, justice system should be involved. The user should be, can't commit crimes to feed your habit. We will provide you treatment, and that's, we've had speed and other things kind of do that. But again, I mean, that we need to kind of, as a society, figure that piece out. And I don't have all the answers. I can just tell you, I think arrest and repeat for people, sniffing fentanyl on the street. I don't know that that's actually going to get us where we need to be. Does that make sense? Yeah. I agree. I mean, I was, again, I was talking to the school folks, and we were talking about the shooting, but they're also talking about, Ingram just had one of their students die from a fentanyl overdose. I don't think he intended to take fentanyl, right? I mean, he was, intending to take some other pill that he thought was something else. But I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, guns are everywhere, but I mean, the fentanyl is just everywhere. And even in drugs or pills that people think are something else, it's that one pill can kill is kind of that's the education piece that the DEA is doing. But it does seem like it's everywhere and affecting everybody. So I totally agree with you. Yeah.
How do we get on the mailing list again for that council meeting?
So yeah, I hope you do join me. You'll probably hear me repeat myself again, but on Wednesday, but the first Wednesday of every month, it's spd.npac@gmail.com, and send an email to. So NorthPAC is actually, it's not run by the police department. It's an independent organization, but they facilitate these meetings. They have guest speakers, and I'm one of those speakers every month. And if you send them an email, say you want to be added to the mailing list, they'll add you to the list, and every month you'll get a link to the Zoom meeting that you can then join. All right.
Captain Grossman, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next time, maybe we'll be able to get Chief Diaz with this.
Chief Diaz, I'm going to tell him he owes you a meeting.
And maybe you too, and maybe we're looking at next year, possibly. Somewhere between September and June of next year, something like that.
Make sure I announce before the end. Hold on. One announcement we forgot to make at the beginning is on January 26th, which is a Thursday evening at 7 p.m. We'll be having a Seattle Police Department personal safety training program. So you're all invited. Hope you consider coming.
Great. All right. Thank you, audience, for your questions and coming tonight on this wintry evening. I hope you have a good evening. Grab yourself a cookie on your way out. Thank you.
Good job, Randy.